They didn't rate you. They looked right through you, called your silence weakness, your patience laziness. In their eyes, you were background noise, easy to dismiss, safe to ignore. They thought you'd fold quietly, but what they didn't see was the sharpening behind every quiet night, behind every ignored move. You were shaping something unstoppable. Picture it. Rooms filled with chatter. Your name dropped like a punchline. They smirked, shared looks, dismissed your grind before it even began. They thought the story ended before the first chapter. But silence was never surrender. Silence was strategy. While they mocked, you mapped. While they doubted, you designed. And every note they missed became energy for your climb. Fam, let me tell you, being unrated is a gift. Because when no one counts you, you get to move uncounted, free, unwatched. You built in shadows they never entered. And when the lights finally caught you, you weren't half ready. You were undeniable. That shock in their eyes, that's the moment disbelief shifted into quiet unease. They wanted you stuck in the margins. But margins don't hold forever. You wrote outside the lines, stretched the canvas, redefined the frame. They thought you needed their approval, their stamp, their nod. Nah, you needed their doubt. Doubt gave you room. Doubt gave you hunger. And hunger built the empire they now whisper about in silence. Now they're unsettled. You can see it. They scroll your moves like cheat sheets, copy your rhythm like students cramming for exams. The same ones who laughed now rehearse your tone, mirror your silence, trace your blueprint. They'll never admit it out loud, but every pause, every borrowed phrase, every quiet imitation speaks one truth. You're running the show. Understand this. They didn't underestimate you. They overestimated themselves. They thought you were invisible. But invisibility is camouflage, and camouflage is how legends are born. You weren't hiding, you were loading. And when you stepped forward, fully built, they froze. That hesitation, that pause, that's the sound of pride cracking under truth. Fam, they used to see you as nothing, but nothing is potential in disguise. They confused silence with weakness, patience with failure. What they missed is this. Storms don't announce themselves, they arrive. And when you arrived, the air shifted, their confidence shook. Because no one rests easy when the person they dismissed becomes the person they follow. They thought control was theirs, but control isn't in the loudest voice. Control lives in presence, and your presence. It turned their rooms quiet. No words, no smirks, just silence. The kind of silence that admits loss without speaking. You didn't demand respect, you became it. And respect, born from shock, always hits deeper than applause. Look around. Every move they make feels late. They stall, they wait, they copy. Leaders don't copy, followers do. And that's their confession. They're not ahead anymore. They're behind, glued to your shadow, hoping to predict your next step. But your steps aren't rehearsed. They're lived. And lived presence always beats borrowed performance. They said you had no voice. But a voice doesn't need their mic. It needs truth. And truth echoes, even in silence. Your silence became thunder. Your patience became prophecy. and prophecy unsettles them. That's why they don't rest. That's why they mimic. Because deep down, they know the one they didn't rate is the one writing the rules now. They whispered you'd fade. But fading never felt like this, because what disappeared was their illusion of control. Not your drive. You didn't need their stage. You built your own arena. And now they sit in the crowd, restless, forced to watch the very show they swore would never exist. That's the twist. Your presence is their new headline. Every restless night they have is proof. Proof that the story flipped. They once laughed when your name came up. Now they avoid it, because it tastes like failure. And failure never sits well, especially when it's self-inflicted. They underestimated patience. They underestimated grit. And now they pay the tax of envy. Shaken, restless, exposed. They tried to measure you with shallow scales. Numbers, likes, applause, but numbers don't crown kings. Discipline does. And you carried that discipline through silence, through shadows, through doubt. That's what built your throne, and a throne built in silence shakes louder than any cheer. They can't deny it now. You sit where they thought you'd never stand. Look at their faces. They rehearse confidence, but eyes don't lie. Eyes always reveal truth, and their truth is unease. Unease of being wrong about you. Unease of admitting they never understood your grind. That's why they copy quietly, because mimicry hides shame, and shame is a weight heavier than any crown you'll ever carry. They said you had no shot, but shots don't crown legends. Shots are noise. You weren't noise. You were signal. And signal travels farther than applause ever can. That's why your presence lingers long after the noise dies. You're not chasing their approval. You're reminding them their doubt aged badly. And nothing unsettles louder than arrogance turned obsolete. Imagine their confusion. They called you invisible. Yet now every move you make sets their agenda. Invisible. Nah, you were just unseen until the right moment. And when the moment hit, you didn't walk in, you owned the room. That's the shift that keeps them awake. Because power borrowed feels fake, but presence lived feels eternal. They used to mock your patience. Now they mimic it. They used to laugh at your silence. Now they study it. They wanted you to break, but breaks never formed. Instead, you stacked bricks, and those bricks became walls they can't climb. That's the part they don't admit, that every doubt thrown your way became the foundation of your empire. They'll never post it, never tag you, never give credit, but their actions betray them. The late night scrolling, the quiet mimicry, the hesitations, that's all confession. Confession that the one they didn't rate became the one they measure against. You don't chase their validation, they chase your shadow. And shadows reveal truth more than speeches ever could. Understand. Your rise isn't about payback, it's about revelation. You revealed that patience outlasts pride, that silence outbuilds noise. You didn't just run the show, you rewrote the script, and rewriting scripts shakes systems. They're not just restless, they're exposed, because exposure always weighs heavier when the light comes from the one they dismissed. Here's the reality. They said you'd vanish. Instead, you multiplied. You multiplied your grind, multiplied your presence, and multiplication doesn't need applause. It needs consistency. Consistency they never had. That's why they can't sleep. Because consistency beats charisma, beats noise, beats doubt. And your consistency built a show they can't escape. They told themselves you'd break, but breaks never came. Instead, you moved smoother, sharper, stronger. That unsettled them, because when weakness doesn't appear, doubt turns inward. And now their doubt isn't about you, it's about themselves. That's the part they'll never say out loud. You didn't just flip their opinion, you fractured their confidence. Think of it. Every time they said you weren't enough, you turned it into fuel. They gave you nothing, and you built everything. They gave you silence, and you turned it into rhythm. They gave you doubt, and you forged it into armor. That's why they can't rest, because every restless night whispers the truth. They miscalculated. They said you'd never run the room. But rooms don't crown leaders. Presence does. And your presence doesn't ask permission. It shifts the air. It silences the noise. It bends the space. That's what unsettled them. Not your words, not your shout, your stillness. Stillness that hit harder than any speech they rehearsed. That's the power they can't copy. Now their stories sound hollow. They brag in public, but in private they scroll through your shadow. That's not respect, it's survival. Because when the one they dismissed runs the show, the only choice left is mimicry. And mimicry isn't leadership, it's surrender. Quiet surrender. Replayed nightly in their restless minds. That's their new reality. They thought disrespect would break you. But disrespect was cement. It hardened your resolve, built your walls, sharpened your edge. And now, those walls tower over their fragile pride. That's why their confidence looks staged. Because deep down they know the truth. When you walk in, their presence shrinks. And shrinking is the loudest confession they'll never admit. Fam. They swore you were background. But background doesn't freeze crowds. Background doesn't silence rooms. You do. And when you did, they realized the joke was on them. Because the one they called irrelevant became the headline. Headlines they can't control. That's why their smiles look forced. Forced smiles always betray the cracks. Pride can't hide. They copy your moves, your rhythm, your timing. But copying doesn't crown leaders. It exposes followers. And followers don't rest easy because they're chasing someone else's script. You're the script now, the play they mimic, the story they trace. But stories traced never hold weight. Originals do, and originals echo until copies fade. They once mocked your grind. Now they mimic it. They once dismissed your silence. Now they study it. And every mimic is confession. Confession that they lost control. Because control means leading, not imitating. They can't lead anymore because the room no longer follows them. The room follows you. And that shift keeps them restless. Understand. They never underestimated you. They underestimated what silence can build. And silence built you sharper than their noise ever could. Noise fades, silence hardens. And hardened presence doesn't just enter rooms, it runs them. That's why they're unsettled, because no one rests easy when the one they laughed at now owns the stage. Here's the truth. They don't respect you out loud. Respect out loud costs pride. But their silence, their mimicry, their restless nights, that's respect unspoken. And unspoken respect is heavier than applause. You didn't chase it, you became it. And becoming respect is what crowned you. That crown can't be borrowed, can't be copied. It can only be lived. They thought strength was loud, but loud crumbles quick. Real strength is steady. You stayed steady when they mocked, when they doubted, when they looked away. That steadiness is what built your crown. And crowns earned in silence weigh heavier than crowns gifted by applause. That weight bends the room when you walk in, and they feel it every time. They used to call you invisible, but invisibility is just preparation disguised. While they flaunted noise, you sharpened in the dark, and when you stepped into the light, their eyes betrayed them. Shock, hesitation, unease. That's why they're unsettled now, because invisibility doesn't mean absent. It means you were stacking a presence too heavy to ignore. They play cool in public, but their silence betrays them. Behind the curtain, it's panic. They refresh your moves, trace your rhythm, mimic your flow. That isn't strategy, it's survival. Survival tethered to the very person they dismissed. And survival like that never feels safe. It feels restless, shaky, endless. That's their new reality, and it's all built on you. They said you weren't built for this, but this doesn't mean their stage. It means your legacy, and legacy doesn't ask to be built. Legacy builds itself through grind. Patience, presence, that's what you did. And now, their noise sounds weak against the echo of your name. Because legacy isn't borrowed. Legacy is lived. And you lived when they laughed. They once swore you couldn't lead. But leadership isn't about followers. It's about truth. And truth is magnetic. You carried it through silence, through doubt, through rejection. And now, the room bends toward you. Even the ones who swore they'd never follow glance for your next move. That glance is leadership. Whether they confess it or not, they said you had no shot. But shots are noise. You didn't need shots. You needed silence. Silence that carved patience, carved focus, carved grit. That grit became armor, and armor outlasts applause. They didn't rate you, but they can't escape you now, because grit lingers, grit crowns, and grit is the reason you run the show today. They tried to cage you with doubt, but cages built from words break fast. You walked through their cage like smoke slipping bars. That freedom is what rattles them now, because they can't bind presence. They can't script silence. They can't cage what was born to run the stage. And when you run the stage, their roles look small. They used to laugh in groups, but now they whisper in shadows. Whispering is the sound of unease disguised. They feared you'd prove them wrong, and you did. They feared you'd rise, and you did. They feared you'd lead, and now you run the show. And nothing rattles pride louder than seeing the one you dismissed holding the crown you wanted. They can mimic your steps, but they can't mimic your source, because source is forged, not copied. They'll always trail behind, always restless, always chasing a rhythm they didn't create. That's why they can't rest. Their pride fights their eyes, but their eyes always reveal the truth. You became the blueprint, and blueprints don't fade, they guide forever. Here's the twist. They didn't just misjudge you. They misjudged silence itself. Silence was never weakness. It was the rehearsal for power. And when power entered the room, it didn't shout. It shifted the air. That shift is yours. That's why they're unsettled. Because power that doesn't demand attention always holds it longer. And you hold it now. They once said you weren't enough. But enough was never the goal. You weren't chasing their bar. You were raising the ceiling. And ceilings don't stop storms. You broke through quietly. And now their pride drips with unease. Because nothing shakes louder than realizing the person you erased is the one setting the rhythm everyone follows. They thought rest was peace. But peace belongs to those who endure. You endured when they doubted. You endured when they mocked. You endured when they turned away. And endurance crowns heavier than applause. That crown rests on you now, and that weight keeps them restless. Haunted by every time they said you couldn't, they pretend it doesn't bother them. But pretending is a costume, and costumes crack. Watch their eyes. Eyes never lie. Eyes confess what mouths hide, and their eyes confess unease. Unease that you'll never slow. Unease that they'll never catch up. Unease that their pride will forever be tethered to your name. And unease is insomnia in disguise. They tried to erase you with silence, but silence is a stage. You turned that stage into legacy. And legacies built in silence don't collapse when the noise fades. They expand. That expansion is what presses on their pride now. Because every move you make widens the gap. And gaps like that don't close. They stay open. They copy your words, your moves, your rhythm. But rhythm borrowed feels hollow. You don't chase hollow. You live whole. That wholeness unsettles them. Because nothing cracks pride faster than authenticity. And authenticity can't be faked. That's why they scroll at night. Because they can copy the surface, but they'll never own the source. The source is lived. Here's the irony. They dismissed you to protect their pride, but that dismissal built your discipline. And discipline is what crowned you. Now their pride bends under the weight of your presence. They wanted to rest easy, knowing you failed. Instead, they stare at ceilings, restless, knowing you didn't. Their failure wasn't your silence. It was their arrogance. They swore you'd fade. But fading never happens to light. Light grows. It spreads. It fills space. You became the flame they can't ignore. And flames don't ask for recognition. They shine. That shine lives in their thoughts now. Glowing at night, flickering at dawn. They can't mute it, can't stop it, because presence this strong doesn't fade. It ignites. They used to measure your worth by applause, but applause is shallow, fading, cheap. Worth lives in endurance, and you endured every dismissal, every laugh, every doubt. That endurance turned into throne. Thrones don't ask to be noticed, they command it. And your throne, it rattles them. Because running the show means their noise no longer matters. They'll never admit it. But mimicry is their confession. Confession that you're the reference point, the blueprint, the story they trace. But stories traced never carry weight. Originals do. And you're the original. That's why they're unsettled, because the one they didn't rate now sets the scale, and scales built from truth don't crack, they last. Here's the final prophecy. They said you were nothing, But nothing became foundation. Nothing became blueprint. Nothing became everything. And everything you built now bends their nights into restless silence. They can't erase it, can't deny it, can't outrun it. Because you don't just run the show. You are the show. And shows built on truth never end.